The storm clouds gathering over Jerusalem that morning carried an unnatural weight, as if the sky itself held its breath for what was coming. Centurion Longinus had commanded executions for 15 years, yet something about this Friday felt different from the moment he received his orders. The prisoner's name was Jesus of Nazareth, and already whispers followed that name through the shadows like wildfire through dry grass. Longinus prided himself on reading condemned men within moments of seeing them. The defiant ones cursed and spat. The broken ones wept and begged. The guilty ones looked away in shame. But when they brought Jesus before him at the Praetorium, the prisoner did none of these things. Instead, Jesus looked directly at him with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through his armor, his rank, his very soul, as if seeing something in Longinus that the centurion himself had forgotten existed. That look would haunt him, though he didn't know it. Yet, that look would change everything. The night before, Pilate's wife had sent an urgent message to her husband. "Have nothing to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered greatly in a dream because of him." Longinus had watched Pilate's face as he read those words, watched the governor's hand tremble slightly before he set the message aside. In 15 years of service, Longinus had never seen the Roman governor of Judea show fear over a single Jewish prisoner. Now, as Jesus stood silently before the tribunal, Pilate leaned forward with obvious unease. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Jesus replied calmly, "You have said so." The chief priests hurled accusation after accusation, but Jesus remained completely silent. Pilate pressed him, "Don't you hear everything they're accusing you of? Won't you defend yourself?" Still, Jesus said nothing, not a single word. Longinus had witnessed hundreds of trials. Criminals always defended themselves. They lied, they bargained, they pleaded. They did anything to save their lives. But this man stood in perfect stillness, as if he was exactly where he chose to be. Something deep within Longinus stirred for the first time, a recognition he couldn't yet name. When Pilate offered the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a notorious murderer, Longinus expected the obvious decision. No sane crowd would choose a killer over a teacher. But the chief priests moved through the masses like poison in water, and soon the chant began, "Release Barabbas! Crucify Jesus!" Longinus watched Pilate's face grow pale as the governor realized he was powerless against the rising fury. When Pilate washed his hands before the crowd, declaring himself innocent of this righteous man's blood, those words hit Longinus like a physical blow. Righteous man. Even Pilate knew. They took Jesus into the Praetorium for the scourging. Longinus had overseen this ritual countless times, but he found himself unable to look away as they stripped Jesus and bound him to the no begging for mercy. Every other man had broken within the first 10 lashes. Jesus endured 39 without a single cry. The soldiers, perhaps disturbed by his silence, began their mockery. They threw a purple robe around his bleeding shoulders and twisted thorns into a crown, driving it deep into his scalp until blood streamed down his face. They placed a reed in his hands like a scepter and knelt before him, shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews!" before spitting on him and striking his head with the reed. Through it all, Jesus kept his eyes open, steady, calm, even for those who tortured him. That stirring in Longinus's chest grew stronger. This was no ordinary prisoner. When they finally dressed Jesus in his own clothes and loaded the crossbeam onto his bloodied shoulders, Longinus took his position at the head of the procession. The path to Golgotha wound through crowded streets, and the weight of the cross quickly overwhelmed Jesus' weakened body. He fell hard onto the stones, the timber crashing down on top of him. As Jesus struggled to rise, Longinus saw something that would burn in his memory forever: the prisoner's mother, Mary, pushing through the crowd with desperate love in her eyes. When she reached her son, she knelt beside him on the blood-stained stones. "My son," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jesus lifted his battered face to her and spoke words that stopped Longinus cold. "You see, Mother, I make all things new." Not words of comfort for a grieving parent, not an expression of pain or defeat. A prophecy, a promise. As if this torture, this humiliation, this march to death was somehow purposeful. Jesus fell twice more before Longinus commanded a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. But even then, Jesus turned to the women weeping for him and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep instead for yourselves and for your children." Who speaks of others' welfare while carrying his own death sentence? At Golgotha, as the soldiers prepared the crosses, something in the atmosphere shifted. The unnatural clouds. Longinus had noticed that mourning now pressed down like a weight, and an eerie stillness settled over the execution ground. Jesus didn't struggle as they stretched his arms across the crossbeam. He didn't resist as they positioned the spikes. He spread his arms willingly, as if offering himself freely to this horror. The hammer fell. Once, twice, 3 times for each hand. Jesus looked up at the darkening sky and spoke words that shattered every assumption Longinus had about condemned men, about justice, about the very nature of God himself. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Forgiveness for the system that was murdering an innocent man. That something stirring in Longinus's chest cracked open like a dam breaking. They raised the cross with a violent thud, and Jesus's body convulsed from the impact. The criminals on either side screamed and cursed, but Jesus remained conscious, his eyes moving across the faces gathered below. When his gaze fell on his mother and the disciple John, he spoke with tender authority. "Woman, behold your son." Then to John, "Behold your mother." Even dying, he cared for others. The darkness had substance, weight, presence. It pressed down on everyone at Golgotha until even the mockery died away into uneasy silence. For 3 hours, the world held its breath. Then Jesus cried out with a voice that seemed to shake the foundations of creation itself. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Some in the crowd thought he was calling for Elijah. Others ran to offer him sour wine. But Longinus understood. This wasn't despair. This was the cry of someone bearing a weight beyond human comprehension. As if all the sin, all the guilt, all the separation between humanity and the divine was crushing down on this one man's shoulders. The air grew heavy with expectation, as if all of creation was poised on the edge of a precipice. Jesus raised his head one final time, gathering every remaining ounce of strength, and declared with startling clarity, "It is finished." Then, looking up into the supernatural darkness, he spoke his last words. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he died. The moment Jesus breathed his last, the earth answered. A violent earthquake shook Jerusalem, splitting rocks and tearing open tombs. But most shocking of all, in the temple itself, the massive veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary tore in two from top to bottom, as if invisible hands had ripped it apart. The crowd that had been mocking minutes before now beat their chests in terror, realizing what they had done. Many fled in panic. But Longinus remained, staring at the dead man on the center cross, his mind reeling as 15 years of certainty crumbled around him. Everything he thought he knew about power, about justice, about the gods themselves had just been turned upside down. This wasn't how executions ended. This wasn't how criminals died. This wasn't. And then, understanding hit him like lightning. This wasn't a criminal at all. The words escaped his lips before he could stop them, spoken with a conviction that came from somewhere deeper than thought. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The first Gentile to publicly acknowledge the crucified Christ was the very centurion who had overseen his execution, as Jewish law demanded no bodies remain on crosses during the Sabbath. Orders came to break the criminals' legs to hasten their deaths. Longinus watched as soldiers shattered the bones of the two thieves, but when they came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. Still, Roman protocol required verification. Longinus took his spear and thrust it into Jesus' side. Immediately, blood and water flowed out, a detail that would later be recorded by eyewitnesses as profound evidence of both death and something far more significant. But as that mixture of blood and water touched Longinus's face, something extraordinary happened. His vision, which had been clouded by an ailment for months, suddenly cleared completely. Not just his physical sight, but his spiritual sight as well. For the first time in his life, he could truly see. Standing there at the foot of the cross, Longinus finally understood what had been stirring within him all day. It wasn't doubt about his duties or sympathy for a victim. It was recognition. His soul had been recognizing truth incarnate, even when his mind couldn't comprehend it. He had just participated in the execution of the Son of God, and that same God had used it as the ultimate act of love and redemption. In the days that followed, As rumors spread through Jerusalem about an empty tomb and sightings of Jesus alive, Longinus felt no skepticism. Instead, he felt quiet, powerful certainty. Of course, Jesus had conquered death. How could death possibly contain the one who had forgiven his own executioners? The man who had spent 15 years serving Rome's power through violence now understood a different kind of power. Entirely. The power of sacrificial love, of forgiveness, of life conquering death itself. Longinus resigned his commission, shed his armor, and walked away from everything he had ever known. The centurion who had once commanded 100 soldiers through fear now traveled alone, carrying only his testimony. I watched him die, and in his death I found life. He had been there. He had seen it all. He had felt the earthquake. He had witnessed the darkness. He had experienced the healing touch of divine blood. But Rome does not forgive those who abandon its authority. Eventually, they came for him. When they offered him freedom in exchange for denying Christ, Longinus responded with unshakable peace. I cannot deny what I have seen with my own eyes and experienced in my own soul. They led him outside the city to a lonely hill, not unlike Golgotha. And there they beheaded him. But Longinus died as he had learned to live after that transformative Friday, with his eyes lifted upward, echoing the words he had heard from the cross. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And through his death, countless others would come to understand the same truth that had transformed a hardened Roman centurion on a dark Friday in Jerusalem. That love is stronger than death, forgiveness more powerful than hatred, and that sometimes the very act of taking a life can become the ultimate revelation of what life truly means. The story of Longinus proves that no one is beyond redemption, no moment too dark for light to penetrate, and no heart too hardened for love to transform. If the man who drove the spear into Jesus' side could become a saint, then transformation is possible for anyone willing to truly see.